"Sir, we're going to need you to leave." The manager's voice cut through the quiet clatter of the diner like a dropped plate. Every head turned. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A little girl in a yellow raincoat froze with her hand wrapped around her father's sleeve. The man at table 7 didn't move. He simply looked up from his coffee, calm in a way that made the moment feel even more dangerous. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You've been sitting here for over an hour. This isn't a place to just camp out." The manager's name tag read Preston Hale. His voice was pitched just loud enough for the whole diner to hear. The way people talk when they want an audience for their own righteousness. The little girl looked up at her father, then at the man standing over them, then back at her father again. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is he being mean to us?" Nobody in that diner knew the answer to that question yet. Nobody knew that the man in the worn gray jacket had just paid his bill in full. Nobody knew he left the same crisp $10 tip he left every single morning, rain or shine, for almost a year. And nobody, not the manager standing over him with his arms crossed, not the customers pretending not to watch, not even the waitress frozen behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, had any idea that the quiet man being humiliated in front of his daughter was about to change the fate of everyone in that room. But to understand how that moment came to be, we have to go back to the beginning, back before the shouting, back before anyone knew his name. Elijah Banks woke up every morning at 5:45, long before the sun had made up its mind to rise. It wasn't an alarm that got him moving. It was habit, the kind carved so deep into a man's bones that his body no longer needed reminding. He'd pad down the hallway of their small 2-bedroom apartment, pass the crayon drawings taped crookedly to the wall, and start the coffee before he did anything else. Then came the harder part of the morning, waking an 8-year-old who did not believe in mornings. Amara, he'd knock softly. "Time to get up, baby." A groan would answer him, then silence, then 5 minutes later, the soft thud of small feet hitting the floor. Amara Banks had her mother's eyes, wide, dark, and endlessly curious, and her father's stubborn chin. She was 8 years old and already had opinions about everything from the correct way to eat pancakes to whether socks needed to match. Elijah never argued with her about the socks. Some battles weren't worth fighting before 7 in the morning. He'd been raising her alone for 5 years now, ever since an illness took her mother, Denise, faster than any of the doctors had predicted. Grief had a way of either breaking a man or reshaping him into something steadier. For Elijah, it had done both. Broken him first, then rebuilt him around the one thing that mattered more than anything else in the world. The small girl who still slept with nightlight shaped like a moon. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Breakfast, backpack check, the walk to the corner, where the school bus stopped. And in between all of that, one more stop, the same stop every single day, at the same small diner 2 blocks from his office. Elijah made her breakfast himself most mornings, nothing fancy, usually eggs and toast, though he'd learned over the years exactly how she liked them. Soft in the middle, never runny. Cut into triangles instead of squares for reasons she'd never fully explained but insisted on anyway. He packed her lunch the night before, so the mornings wouldn't feel rushed, tucking a small note into the bag more often than not. Sometimes it just said, "Have a good day, baby girl." Sometimes it was a bad joke he'd heard somewhere, the kind that made Amara groan and roll her eyes and secretly keep in the front pocket of her backpack anyway. "Daddy, this joke doesn't even make sense," she told him once, holding up a folded napkin that read asterisk, "Why did the math book look sad?" "Because it had too many problems." "Asterisk, it's a classic," Elijah said, without a trace of apology. "It's terrible. You kept it, though." She hadn't had a good answer for that. Some mornings, when there was time, he walked her all the way to the school doors instead of just a bus stop. And it was on one of those mornings that her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, caught him at the entrance before he could slip away. "Mr. Banks, do you have a second?" He did, always, no matter how tight his own schedule looked on paper. "Of course. I just want to say, Amara's been doing wonderfully. She helped a new student find her classroom last week, all on her own, No one asked her to. She's got a good heart on her. Elijah watched his daughter through classroom window, already deep in conversation with a friend, gesturing with both hands the way she did when a story felt especially important. She gets that from her mother, he said quietly. Mrs. Alvarez smiled, the kind of smile that understood there was more behind the sentence than he was saying, and didn't push for anything further. Well, whoever she gets it from, it's rare. You should be proud. I am, Elijah said, every single day. He walked back toward his office after that with something warm sitting in his chest, the particular pride that had nothing to do with balance sheets or acquisitions and everything to do with a small girl who noticed when someone else needed a friend. The Wildflower Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Miller, its windows always fogged faintly from the griddle inside, its awning a shade of yellow that had faded gently over the years without ever looking shabby. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It smelled like coffee and bacon, and something warmer than either. The particular comfort of a place that had never once tried to impress anyone. Elijah arrived at 7:15 every morning without fail. He ordered black coffee and buttered toast. He sat at the same table by the window. He read the newspaper, or sometimes just watched the street outside, and 20 minutes later, he left the same way he came in, quiet, polite, and unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But there was one thing about him that made the staff at the Wildflower Diner pay very close attention indeed. Every single morning, without exception, he left a crisp $10 bill beside his coffee cup. Not $9, not 11, exactly 10. Folded once, placed with kind of quiet intention that made it feel less like a tip and more like a small ceremony. Renee Walker had been waiting tables at the Wildflower Diner for almost 2 years. She was 24, sharp-eyed, and permanently exhausted in the specific way that only working full-time while attending nursing school at night could make a person exhausted. She kept a highlighter behind her ear more often than a pen, and her apron pockets were more likely to contain flashcards about cardiac rhythms than actual order pads. She noticed Elijah the very first week he started coming in, not because he was loud or demanding or difficult. He was the opposite of all those things. She noticed him because he was quiet in a way that seemed deliberate, like a man who had learned that saying less usually meant fewer people paid attention to him. And in her experience, people who tried that hard to be unremarkable usually had a reason. "He's here again," her co-worker Tasha said one morning, nudging Renee with an elbow as the bell above the door chimed. Table 7's future husband. He's a customer, Tasha. A customer who leaves a $10 tip on a $4 order. Every day. That's not a customer. That's a mystery novel. Renee rolled her eyes, but she couldn't argue with the math. She'd seen a lot of tipping habits in 2 years of waiting tables. Generous ones, stingy ones, the kind that depended entirely on whether someone's stock portfolio had a good morning. But she had never seen anyone tip the exact same amount every single day with that same careful precision. She carried his coffee over that morning the way she did every morning, setting it down without needing to ask how he took it. Black, no sugar. She'd learned that within the first week. "Morning, Mr. Banks." "Morning, Renee." He looked up from his paper and offered the same small, polite smile he always did. It didn't reach all the way to his eyes, not quite, but it was warm enough to feel genuine. "Toast will be right out. Take your time." She never had to take much time. He never complained, never rushed her, never made her feel like his 20 minutes in that booth were more important than the 11 other tables she was juggling. In a job that mostly taught her about the worst of people's patience, Elijah Banks was a small, steady reminder that some people still had manners. What she didn't know, what nobody at the Wildflower Diner knew, was that the quiet man in the plain gray jacket wasn't just some accountant or mid-level office worker killing time before his shift. But that discovery was still months away. For now, all Renee knew was a $10 bill, folded once, left behind every single morning like a small, unanswered question. Renee understood hard mornings better than most people her age. She'd grown up the oldest of 3 in a house where her mother worked nights at a packaging plant, and her father had been mostly absent since she was 12. present in birthdays and disappointing in almost everything else. She'd learned early how to stretch a grocery budget, how to make a younger sibling laugh when the lights bill had eaten into the money set aside for something nicer. Nursing school wasn't just a career path for her. It was a promise she'd made to herself the year her little brother spent 3 days in a hospital with pneumonia, and she watched a nurse named Patricia treat him like he mattered more than any chart or clipboard ever could. You're going to be exactly like her one day. Her mother had told her, watching Patricia adjust her brothers for the kind of gentle competence that made frightened children feel safe. I can already tell. Renee had held on to that sentence for years. Through every exhausting double shift at the diner, through every late night hunched over a biology textbook at the kitchen table long after her roommates had gone to sleep. It was part of why she noticed Elijah Banks the way she did. Not because he was mysterious, though he was, but because he reminded her of the quiet, steady kindness she was trying to build her whole future around. He never made her feel small for being tired. He never made her feel like a waitress was all she'd ever be. He asked about her exams like the answer genuinely mattered to him. And in a life that had taught her to expect very little of that from strangers, it meant more than he probably realized. Some mornings, Elijah didn't come alone. On the days Amara didn't have an early bus, he'd bring her with him, settling her into the booth across from him with a hot chocolate and a stack of pancakes. She insisted on drowning in syrup despite his gentle protests. Those mornings were Renee's favorite, though she never quite admitted that out loud. "You want extra whipped cream on that, baby?" Renee would ask, and Amara would nod so enthusiastically her braids swung across her shoulders. "Yes, please. Lots and lots." "You got it." Amara had her father's habit of watching people closely, taking in details most adults missed. One morning, while Elijah was distracted reading something on his phone, she tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, why you always give her the same money?" Elijah glanced at Renee, who was 2 tables away, and pretending very hard not to be listening. "What do you mean, baby?" "The $10. Every day it's the same $10. I counted." He smiled, the real kind this time, the kind that softened the tired lines around his eyes. "You're pretty observant, you know that?" Mommy used to say I notice everything. The mention of her mother, casual and easy the way it usually was these days, didn't make his chest tighten the way it used to. Grief had mellowed into something gentler over the years, something that lived alongside them instead of on top of them. "It's kind of a promise," he said finally. "I'll tell you the whole story one day, when you're a little older." Amara considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old could bring to a syrup-covered pancake. "Is it a good story or a sad story?" "Both," Elijah admitted. "The best ones usually are." She seemed satisfied with that answer, at least for now, and went back to her pancakes. But Renee, wiping down the table beside them, found herself thinking about that exchange for the rest of her shift. A promise, both a good story and a sad one. She didn't know why, but something about the way he'd said it settled into her curiosity and refused to leave. Weeks passed the way they do when a routine becomes something closer to comfort. Elijah kept coming. Renee kept pouring his coffee. Amara kept ordering pancakes. With too much syrup on the mornings, she tagged along. And every day, the same $10 bill appeared beside the same empty coffee cup. Like clockwork, like a small, quiet promise being kept over and over, without anyone ever asking who it was made to. Renee began to look forward to those 20 minutes more than she wanted to admit. There was something steadying about Elijah Banks. The way he always asked about her nursing exams. The way he actually listened when she answered. The way he never once made her feel like the tired girl behind the counter, instead of a person with a whole life waiting outside the diner walls. "How'd the pharmacology exam go?" he asked one morning, not looking up from his coffee at first, like the question was almost an afterthought. "It never was. I passed," Renee said, unable to keep the pride out of her voice. "Barely, but I passed." "Barely means you passed." Elijah said, "Nobody remembers a margin. They remember the diploma. You always say things like that. Only when they're true." She laughed, wiping down the counter beside his table, even though it didn't need it. You know, most of my customers ask me for extra ketchup. You're the only one who asks about my GPA. Most of your customers probably aren't as impressed by you as I am. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. There was something too careful, too respectful in the way he said it, like a man who had learned the hard way not to say more than he meant. But it landed somewhere warm in Renee's chest anyway, and she found herself smiling about it long after he'd left for the day. She didn't know his last name came attached to a company worth more money than she could picture. She didn't know that the calm, unhurried man in the plain jacket had once sat in boardrooms deciding the fate of entire city blocks. All she knew was that he showed up every morning, treated her like she mattered, and left the same $10 bill like it meant something he'd never fully explained. She was starting to think it was time she asked. There was a particular Thursday, gray and heavy with an early rain, when the diner had emptied out faster than usual, and Renee found herself with a rare few minutes to actually sit down. Elijah was still at his booth, in no hurry, watching the rain streak down the window glass. "Mind if I take a break here?" she asked, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Boss says I'm allowed exactly one, and I'm cashing in early. Please." He slid his newspaper aside to make room. She sank into the booth with the particular relief of someone whose feet had been complaining for the last 4 hours. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business." "You can ask. What do you actually do? For work? I mean, you always seem so calm about it. Whatever it is. Most people who come through here before 9 in the morning look like they're bracing for a car crash." Elijah considered the question longer than it probably needed, the way he considered most things. "I run a company that manages properties. Buildings, mostly. Restaurants, apartment complexes, a few hotels." "That sounds stressful." "It can be. But I learned a long time ago that most problems look a lot bigger at 6 in the morning than they actually are. If you can sit with something for 20 minutes before you react to it, you usually make a better decision." Renee turned that over in her mind. "Is that why you come here every morning? Just to sit with things?" "Partly." He looked out at the rain again. "Mostly I come here because it's the only 20 minutes of my day where nobody needs anything from me. My daughter needs me. My company needs me. This booth doesn't need anything at all. That's a nice way to put it. It's the only way I've found to stay sane some days." She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're a lot more thoughtful than most of the businessmen who come through here. Most of them are on their phones the entire time, barking at somebody about numbers." "I used to be like that," Elijah admitted, "early on when the company was small and every decision felt like it could break us. My mother used to tell me that the way you treat people when you're stressed says more about you than the way you treat them when everything's easy." Took me a while to actually believe her. Sounds like she was a smart woman. "She was the smartest person I ever knew," he said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of it told Renee not to push further. Not yet. The rain kept falling outside, steady and unhurried, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything else. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill every space with words. There was another morning, not long before all of it, when Renee arrived at work with her eyes red-rimmed and her movements a half-step slower than usual. She tried to hide it, throwing herself into the breakfast rush with more energy than she actually had. But Elijah noticed anyway. He noticed most things about the people around him, a habit built from years of paying close attention to rooms that had once decided he wasn't worth watching. "Rough night?" he asked when she brought his coffee. "Rough week," Renee admitted, setting the cup down carefully. "Lost a patient during my clinical rotation yesterday. First time that's happened to me. They tell you it's going to happen eventually, but nobody really tells you how it feels." "I'm sorry," Elijah said, and there was nothing performative in it, just simple, direct sympathy. "How are you doing today?" "Honestly, tired. Second-guessing whether I'm cut out for this." "You are," he said, without a second of hesitation. "You don't know that." I know you cried about a patient you couldn't save instead of shrugging it off and moving on to the next chart. That tells me everything I need to know about whether you're cut out for it. The people who shouldn't be doing this work are the ones who stop feeling it. Renee felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, the particular relief of hearing exactly what you needed to hear from someone who had no obligation to say it. You always know what to say. Not always, Elijah said, but when it matters, I try. She lingered at his table a moment longer than her shift technically allowed, and when she finally walked away to check on another table, she found herself standing a little straighter than she had all morning. It was a small thing, a few sentences exchanged over a coffee cup, but it was the kind of small thing that added up over the course of a year into something that felt a great deal like being cared for. It was a Tuesday in early autumn when the sky outside the Wildflower Diner had gone the particular gray that meant rain was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. Elijah arrived at his usual time, Amara trailing behind him in her yellow raincoat, her backpack slung over one shoulder. It was a half day at school, and she'd insisted on coming along instead of going straight to her aunt's. "Can I have the pancakes today, Daddy?" "Please. You have pancakes every day you come here. That's because they're the best pancakes in the whole city." Elijah laughed, low and easy, and let her lead him to their usual booth by the window. Renee met them there within a minute, coffee pot already in hand. "Morning, you too." The usual, Elijah confirmed. "Extra whipped cream," Amara added seriously, as if this were a critical detail that could not go unstated. Wouldn't dream of forgetting it. The diner was busier than normal that morning. A private event downtown had brought in a wave of unfamiliar faces, men and women in expensive coats ordering complicated coffee orders and checking their phones between bites. Renee moved between tables at double speed, apologizing for delays she couldn't help, refilling cups faster than she could catch her breath. It was in the middle of that chaos that Preston Hale walked through the door for the first time. He was new. The diner's parent company had recently brought him on as a regional operations manager, tasked with tightening up what corporate called efficiency metrics across a handful of underperforming locations. Nobody at the Wildflower had met him yet. Nobody knew what kind of man he was. They were about to find out. Preston moved through the diner with the brisk, proprietary stride of a man who had just been handed a title and intended to use every syllable of it. He clocked the crowded tables, the slow-moving line at the register, the general hum of a small business trying to keep up with an unusually busy morning. None of it impressed him. His eyes landed on table 7, a man in a worn gray jacket, work boots that had clearly seen better years. A little girl beside him with syrup on her chin and a hot chocolate cooling in front of her. They'd been sitting there. Preston checked his watch. For nearly 40 minutes. 2 coffees, 1 plate of toast, 1 kid's meal. On a morning this busy, that table represented lost revenue in his mind. Plain and simple. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wonder about the man's story. He simply walked over, arms already crossed before he'd said a single word, and made a decision about a stranger based entirely on what his eyes told him in 3 seconds. "Sir, we're going to need you to leave." Elijah looked up slowly. Amara froze mid-bite, her fork hovering above her plate. "I'm sorry. You've been sitting here for over an hour. This isn't a place to just camp out. We've got paying customers waiting for tables." The words landed hard in the small space between them. A few nearby customers glanced over, then quickly looked away. The particular flinch of people who sense something is about to happen and would rather not be involved. "I am a paying customer," Elijah said, his voice even, unhurried. "I've ordered every morning for almost a year. I paid my bill 5 minutes ago. That's not really the issue." Preston's tone stayed clipped, performative, pitched for the room rather than the man in front of him. "The issue is turnover. We can't have people using this place like a waiting room." Renee had gone still behind the counter, coffee pot frozen mid-pour. She recognized the shift in the air immediately, the particular tension of a situation sliding somewhere it shouldn't go. "Mr. Hale," she started, stepping forward. "I've got this," Preston said without looking at her, which was its own kind of answer. Amara's small hand found her father's sleeve and gripped it. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice carrying farther than she meant it to in the sudden hush of the diner. "Why is he being mean to us?" The question hit the room like a dropped glass. A few tables over, a woman set down her fork entirely. The cook, visible through the pass-through window, went still. Elijah looked at his daughter first, always his daughter first, and kept his voice gentle even as something harder settled behind his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby," he said quietly. "Not one thing." Then he looked back at Preston. "I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of this location." "I am in charge," Preston said. "Regional operations. And I'm telling you politely that it's time to go." There was nothing polite in his voice at all. What happened over the next 4 minutes would be talked about at the Wildflower Diner for months afterward, not because of what Elijah Banks did, but because of what he didn't. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up abruptly or slam a hand on the table. He didn't reach for his wallet to flash proof of anything. Didn't threaten to call anyone. Didn't do a single thing that would have given Preston Hale the satisfaction of an overreaction to point to later. He simply sat there, one hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder, and absorbed the humiliation with the kind of stillness that unsettled people more than anger ever could. "Sir, I need you to understand," Preston pressed on, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "This isn't personal. It's policy." "It's felt pretty personal so far," Elijah said. A murmur moved through the nearby tables. Someone near the counter had quietly taken out their phone, the way people did now when they sense a moment worth remembering, holding it low and steady, not wanting to be noticed doing it. Renee couldn't stay silent any longer. She set the coffee pot down hard enough that it rattled against the counter and crossed the floor in 4 quick steps. "Preston," her voice was tight, controlled, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "This man has been a regular here for almost a year. He's never caused a single problem. He tips better than anyone who's ever sat in this diner. You cannot do this." "I appreciate your input," Preston said, not looking at her, "but staffing decisions and floor management aren't your department. This isn't about staffing. This is about you deciding a man doesn't belong here because of how he's dressed." The words landed exactly where she meant them to. A few customers who had been pretending not to watch stopped pretending entirely. Preston's jaw tightened. "That is not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" Renee asked, and for a moment the whole diner seemed to be waiting on his answer. He didn't have one. Not really. Just a vague gesture toward turnover numbers and policy language that sounded thinner every time he repeated it. Amara, watching all of this unfold with the wide, unblinking attention only children bring to adult conflict, tugged her father's sleeve again. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" "No, baby," Elijah said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not louder, but steadier, the voice of a man who had made a decision. "We didn't do anything wrong." Sometimes grown-ups get confused about who deserves respect. That's not the same as us being in trouble. Preston's face reddened slightly at that, whether from anger or the first flicker of doubt. It was impossible to say. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," he said finally, falling back on the only script he had left. "If you won't go voluntarily, I'll have to call for assistance." The threat hung in the air. Somewhere near the register, a man in a business suit shook his head slowly, disbelief plain on his face. Tasha had come out from behind the counter, arms crossed, watching with an expression that made it clear exactly whose side she was on. Elijah looked around the diner slowly, at the frozen faces, the phones held low, his daughter's worried eyes, and then back at Preston. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Call whoever you need to call. I'm not going anywhere until my daughter finishes her pancakes." Preston did exactly that. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security guards from the office building next door, men Preston had apparently arranged beforehand, expecting some version of this exact confrontation, pushed through the diner's front door. They moved toward table 7 with the practice, heavy-footed patience of men who had done this before, Men who rarely stopped to ask themselves why. The diner had gone almost entirely silent by then, the clatter of forks and quiet conversation replaced by something tighter, more watchful. Renee stood a few feet away, her hands balled into fists at her sides, feeling helpless in a way that made her stomach twist. Amara looked at the two large men approaching their table and instinctively scooted closer to her father, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "are they going to make us leave?" Elijah kept his hand steady on her shoulder. "Not today, baby. I promise you that." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with the guards as they positioned themselves on either side of the booth. He simply reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. The diner watched him do it with the particular fascination of people who sense they're witnessing something they don't yet understand. "It's me," he said quietly into the phone, his voice calm and unhurried even now. "I need you to send someone to the Wildflower location on 5th and Miller. Now, please." He ended the call less than 30 seconds later and slid the phone back into his pocket, meeting Preston's eyes without a flicker of hesitation. "You can wait outside if you'd like," Preston said, some of his earlier confidence wavering now, though he clearly hadn't figured out why yet. "Or my associates can help you find the door." "I think I'll wait right here," Elijah said. "My daughter's not finished eating." For the first time since he'd walked through the door that morning, Preston Hale looked genuinely uncertain. Something about the stillness in front of him, the complete absence of panic, the calm phone call, the way this quiet man in a worn jacket had not once raised his voice despite everything happening around him, didn't match the story Preston had told himself when he'd first looked across the diner and decided this table was a problem to solve. He didn't know it yet, but the story he'd told himself was about to fall apart completely. Not everyone in the diner stayed silent. Near the counter, an older man who'd been reading his own newspaper folded it slowly and set it down, watching the scene with a particular disapproval of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize exactly what it looked like when someone made a snap judgment they weren't willing to walk back. "Son," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room, "that man's been sitting in this diner every single morning for as long as I've been coming here. Longer than you probably worked here, I guess." Preston didn't look at him. "Sir, this isn't your concern. It became my concern the moment you decided to embarrass a father in front of his little girl over a table he already paid for." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the nearby booths. Tasha, still frozen behind the counter, felt a flicker of something like hope, watching strangers do what she hadn't yet found the courage to do herself. When the two security guards arrived a few minutes later, one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis who'd worked the building next door for almost 6 years, hesitated a moment. He actually looked at the table he'd been sent to clear. He'd seen plenty of situations in his line of work that felt clean and simple on paper and messy the second you stood in front of them. This felt messy from the very first second. A grown man, calm and unmoving. A little girl with syrup still on her chin, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. No shouting, no disturbance. Nothing that matched the kind of call he was used to responding to. "You sure about this?" Curtis asked Preston quietly, low enough that most of the diner couldn't hear it. "Doesn't look like a security situation to me." "Just do your job," Preston said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Curtis glanced at Elijah, then at Amara, then back at Preston, and something in his jaw tightened. He didn't refuse outright. That wasn't a decision he had the authority to make on his own, not with his job on the line too. But he took his position beside the booth without a single word of the aggression Preston clearly expected from him, standing more like a man waiting for someone to tell him this had all been a mistake than a man enforcing an eviction. It was into that exact silence, thick with everyone's private discomfort, that Elijah made his phone call. The next 10 minutes stretched longer than any of the diner's regulars could remember a silence lasting. Amara finished her pancakes in small, careful bites, unusually quiet for a girl who normally couldn't stop narrating her breakfast. Elijah sat with one arm around her, watching the door. Renee found herself standing closer to their table than her job technically required, refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling, unwilling to leave him alone with Preston hovering nearby, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. "You don't have to do that," Elijah said quietly, nodding at the water pitcher in her hands. "I know," Renee said. "I want to." He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then the bell above the diner's door chimed. 3 people walked in together. 2 men in dark suits and a woman carrying a leather portfolio, all 3 moving with a kind of brisk, purposeful energy that immediately reorganized the attention of everyone in the room. They scanned the diner quickly and then walked directly toward table 7, no hesitation at all, as if they'd known exactly where to look. "Mr. Banks," the older of the 2 men said, extending a hand. "I'm so sorry it took us this long to get here." The diner went very quiet. Preston Hale's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession. Confusion, then a flicker of recognition at the name, then something closer to dread as the pieces began arranging themselves in his mind. "Banks," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. As in Banks Hospitality Group," the woman with the portfolio said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact that would need no further clarification. "Elijah Banks is the founder and majority owner. He also happens to own the parent company that operates this diner chain." Somewhere near the counter, a coffee cup clattered against a saucer as someone's hand went unsteady. Renee felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she didn't move an inch. A year of black coffee and buttered toast. A year of the same folded $10 bill. A year of a quiet man who had never once mentioned that the little diner where he brought his daughter for pancakes was, in some very real sense, his own. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing useful came out. Elijah rose slowly from the booth, one hand resting on Amara's shoulder, and looked at the man who, 20 minutes earlier, had tried to have him removed from a diner he owned in front of his own daughter. "I'd like everyone to hear this clearly," he said, and though his voice was no louder than it had been the entire morning, it seemed to fill every corner of the room. "This isn't about titles or ownership. It never has been. It's about how you treat someone when you think it doesn't matter, when you think no one important is watching." Preston Hale stood very still, the way people do when the ground is genuinely shifted beneath them and they haven't yet worked out how to stand on it. "Mr. Banks, I had no way of knowing. That's the whole point," Elijah said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "You didn't know, and it shouldn't have mattered whether you did." He looked around the diner slowly, taking in the frozen faces, the phone still held low, his daughter watching him with wide, careful eyes. "You looked at me," he continued, "and you saw a jacket that's a few years old. You saw work boots instead of dress shoes. You decided, in about 3 seconds, that I didn't belong in a place I've been coming to almost every single day for nearly a year, and you did it in front of my daughter." Preston's face had gone the color of the countertop. "Sir, I believe you," Elijah said, and something in his tone made it clear he meant it, which somehow made it worse. "I believe you had no idea who I was. I believe that's exactly the problem." He turned to the woman with the portfolio, pulled a full personnel file. "I want to understand how someone with this decision-making pattern ended up managing 3 locations instead of none." "Right away," she said, already reaching for her phone. Preston's mouth opened again, some half-formed protest rising and dying before it could take shape. He looked toward the door, toward the 2 security guards who had been called to remove a paying customer and now looked deeply uncertain about their own role in the last 10 minutes, and found no version of this moment that ended in his favor. "You're relieved of your position, effective today," Elijah said quietly. "Not because of who I turned out to be. Because of what you were willing to do to a stranger you assumed had no power to answer back. That would have been true no matter who I was." The diner held its breath. Amara tugged gently on her father's hand. "Daddy," she whispered, though not so quietly this time, "does this mean we get to keep coming here?" The tension in the room broke all at once, a ripple of something between relief and quiet, laughter moving to the nearby tables. Even the older gentleman with the portfolio pressed his lips together to keep from smiling. Elijah looked down at his daughter, at her syrup-smudged chin and her wide, uncomplicated concern about pancakes rather than corporate consequences, and felt the tightness in his chest finally ease. "Yeah, baby," he said. "We get to keep coming here." Preston Hale left through the front door he'd once used to summon security against a customer, his exit far quieter than his entrance had been. Nobody applauded. Nobody jeered. The diner simply watched him go, the way people watch a storm finally pass. With relief, not triumph. Renee stood frozen behind the counter, the water pitcher still in her hands, trying to reconcile the quiet man who asked about her nursing exams with the name now being spoken so carefully by the strangers in dark suits. Elijah Banks. Banks Hospitality Group. She'd heard that name before, in passing on the news, attached to headlines about affordable housing developments and community investment funds, though she'd never once connected to the man who left $10 beside his coffee cup every single morning. He caught her eye across the diner and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I probably should have mentioned that a little sooner," he said. "You think?" Renee managed, and despite everything, despite the tension still humming through the room, she found herself laughing, a short, disbelieving sound that broke something loose in her chest. "It never seemed important," Elijah said. "You never asked." "I'm asking now." He glanced at Amara, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a girl who understood that something significant had just happened, even if she couldn't name exactly what. "Tomorrow," he said, "I promise. If you have a few minutes before your shift starts, I'll tell you everything." Renee held his gaze for a long moment, feeling the weight of that promise settle somewhere she didn't fully understand yet. "I'll hold you to that," she said. The morning after the confrontation, the Wildflower Diner filled up faster than it had in months. Word had already begun to travel through the neighborhood the way it does in close communities, not through news articles yet, just through people who'd been there, telling other people who hadn't. An elderly woman named Mrs. Odom, who'd been coming to the diner every Wednesday for 11 years, stopped by Elijah's table on her way out, resting a weathered hand briefly on his shoulder. "I heard what happened," she said. "I'm sorry that man treated you and that sweet girl that way. But I want you to know the way you handled it, calm as you were, that's not something everybody could manage. That's character, and character's rarer than money these days." "Thank you," Elijah said, genuinely touched. "That means a lot." "It should," Mrs. Odom said simply, and continued on her way. Tasha, still shaken from the morning before, found a quiet moment to approach Renee behind the counter. "I should have said something sooner," she admitted. "The second he walked up to that table, I knew it was wrong. I just froze." "You're not the only one," Renee said gently. "It happened fast. Nobody expects to have to stand up to something like that before their coffee's even finished brewing. Still, I keep thinking about that little girl's face." "Me too," Renee admitted. "I don't think I'm going to forget it for a long time." Neither of them mentioned it, but both women understood something had shifted in how they thought about their own responsibilities at work. Not out of fear of losing their jobs, but out of a clearer sense of what silence could cost the people standing in front of them. Word moved fast after that. By that afternoon, half the neighborhood had heard some version of what happened at the Wildflower Diner. The quiet businessman, the humiliated father. The security guards called on a man who turned out to own the building they were standing in. Some versions exaggerated. Some got the details wrong entirely. But the core of it stayed true no matter how many times the story got retold. A man had been judged by his jacket and his boots in front of his daughter, and the truth had arrived just in time to answer for it. What most people didn't realize, and what Elijah made no effort to correct, was that this wasn't really a story about being wealthy enough to demand respect. It was a story about a man who had learned a long time ago exactly what it felt like to be dismissed by people who decided before he opened his mouth that he didn't matter. That lesson hadn't come from a boardroom. It had come from a diner very much like this one, more than 30 years earlier, when Elijah Banks was a boy who understood far more about hunger and hardship than any child should have to. Elijah's father had died when he was 6 years old, quickly and without much warning. The way some losses arrived without giving anyone time to prepare. His mother, Ruth Banks, had been left to raise him alone on a hospital custodian's salary that barely covered rent, let alone the unexpected costs that seemed to multiply the moment a family lost its second income. She never complained about it. Not once, not in front of him. She worked mornings at a laundromat and evenings cleaning offices downtown, and somewhere in between those two jobs, she found time to walk him to school, help with his homework, and remind him every single night, without fail, that they would be okay as long as they had each other. There was one winter, though, when okay had felt like a very fragile promise. The heat had gone out in their apartment building for 11 days that January, and the landlord had taken his time fixing it. Ruth had pretended she wasn't hungry more nights than young Elijah had understood at the time, quietly pushing her portion of dinner toward him when she thought he wasn't watching. They fell 2 months behind on rent. There were conversations Elijah wasn't supposed to hear, hushed and worried, about what would happen if they fell behind a third month. Ruth worked a Tuesday morning shift at a small diner near the hospital during that stretch, filling in for a friend who'd taken ill. It wasn't a regular job, just a few extra hours here and there to help cover the gap. One morning, a customer she'd never seen before, an older man in a plain coat, unremarkable in every way, left a $10 bill on the counter after his coffee. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he came back the next morning, and the next, and the one after that, $10 every single day for almost 3 weeks. He never explained why. He never said much of anything at all, just thanked her quietly and left before she could really ask. Elijah still remembered the exact texture of that winter, the way memory sometimes holds on to details that don't seem important until decades later. He remembered the apartment's single space heater, moved from room to room depending on who needed it most. He remembered his mother's coat, the one with the missing button she never replaced because the money always went somewhere more urgent. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table doing homework by the light of a lamp instead of the overhead fixture, because Ruth was trying to keep the electric bill from climbing any higher than it already had. He remembered, too, the morning she came home from that diner shift with something different in her face. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first flicker of it. "A man left me $10 today," she told him, setting her purse down on the counter. Just a regular tip on a $2 coffee. Didn't say much of anything. Just thank you and goodbye. "That's good, right?" "It's good," she said, though her voice carried a kind of disbelief, like she wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Ruth started watching for him without meaning to, this quiet man in an unremarkable coat who never lingered, never made conversation beyond a polite thank you, never gave any indication that he understood exactly how much those folded bills meant to the woman refilling his coffee. "Why do you think he does it?" Young Elijah had asked her one evening, watching her count the week's tips at the kitchen table, relief written plainly across her tired face. "I don't know, baby," Ruth said. Maybe somebody did the same for him once. Maybe he just decided the world needed a little more of it. Doesn't much matter why. What matters is he did it. Are we going to be okay now? She pulled him into her lap, even though he was getting too big for it. Rested her chin on top of his head the way she always did when she wanted him to feel steadier than the situation actually was. "We were always going to be okay," she told him. "This just makes the road a little smoother for a while." The stranger's visit stopped as suddenly as they'd started, 3 weeks almost to the day, and Ruth never saw him again after that. She asked around, quietly, hoping to at least learn his name so she could thank him properly, but nobody at the diner seemed to know much about him either. Just a regular who'd stopped being regular, the way people sometimes do. She talked about him for years afterward, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet reverence, the way people talk about the exact moment their luck changed even if they can't fully explain why. It became a kind of family legend, retold at kitchen tables, and later, once Elijah had a family of his own, retold again to a granddaughter who never got the chance to meet the woman who started it all. Those $10 bills didn't fix everything. They didn't erase the 2 months of back rent or make the winter any warmer. But they bought groceries on nights when the refrigerator had gone embarrassingly empty. They kept the lights on for one more week when the shut-off notice arrived. They gave Ruth Banks just enough room to breathe at exactly the moment she needed it most. She never learned his name. She never saw him again after that stretch ended. But she talked about him for the rest of her life. The stranger who chose kindness for no reason at all, who never once let it become a spectacle, who simply showed up quietly and left before anyone could turn his generosity into a performance. Ruth Banks passed away when Elijah was 26, only a few years after he'd started the small property management business that would eventually grow into Banks' hospitality group. She'd lived long enough to see him succeed, long enough to watch him buy her a small house with a garden she'd always wanted, but not long enough to see everything he would go on to build. In her final weeks, she made him promise her something. "If life ever blesses you," she told him, her voice thin but steady, her hand wrapped around his, "you remember what that $10 meant to us. You remember it wasn't about the money. It was about somebody deciding we were worth showing up for, even when we couldn't do anything for them in return. I remember, Mama. Then promise me you won't forget it. Not when you're comfortable. Not when it's easy to look past people. I promise." He kept that promise in more ways than most people ever knew. Banks' Hospitality Group had quietly funded scholarship programs for hospitality workers pursuing degrees. It had built a reputation, unusual for a company its size, for promoting from within, for treating housekeeping staff and kitchen crews with the same basic dignity as executives in the corner offices. And every single morning, in a diner 2 blocks from his headquarters, Elijah Banks left exactly $10 beside his coffee cup, a small, quiet ritual that connected him to a debt he could never fully repay and had long ago stopped trying to. He'd never told Amara the full story. Not yet. She was still young enough that some of the sharper edges of it, the cold apartment, the hunger her grandmother had hidden from her own son, felt like more weight than an 8-year-old needed to carry. But he was building toward it. The way you build toward anything a child needs to understand slowly instead of all at once. He hadn't expected to tell the story to anyone else. Certainly not to a waitress with a highlighter behind her ear and calluses forming on her feet from double shifts. But something about Renee Walker, her tired persistence, her refusal to let unfairness pass without saying something, the way she stood her ground in front of Preston Hale, without a second's hesitation, reminded him powerfully of his mother. He decided, somewhere in the quiet after the confrontation, that she deserved to hear it. The morning after the incident, Elijah arrived at the Wildflower Diner earlier than usual, a full 15 minutes before his typical time. Amara was with her aunt that morning, which meant the booth by the window felt a little emptier than it usually did, though not unpleasantly so. Renee spotted him the moment he walked in and crossed the diner, without waiting to be asked, sliding into the seat across from him with the particular boldness of someone who had earned the right to sit down. "You remember what you promised," she said. "I remember." She waited, not saying anything else, giving him the space to begin however he needed to. Elijah wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, looking out the window for a moment before he spoke, the way people do when they're gathering something from a long way back. "When I was 8 years old," he began, "my father passed away. My mother had to raise me on her own after that, working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat." Renee listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned during long nursing shifts when patients needed someone to simply be present. "There was a winter when things got really bad. We were behind on rent. She used to say she wasn't hungry, so I could have more to eat, and it took me years to understand that wasn't true." He paused. "One morning, a stranger left her a $10 tip at the diner where she was filling in for a friend. He came back the next morning and did it again, and the morning after that. For how long? Almost 3 weeks. She never learned his name. She never saw him again after that. But it got us through the worst of it, groceries, the electric bill, small things that felt enormous at the time." He looked up, meeting Renee's eyes. Before she died, she made me promise that if life ever blessed me, I wouldn't forget what that kindness meant. So when I built this company, I started coming back to places like this, diners like the one where she worked. And every morning I leave $10. Not because it's a lot of money to me now, but because once it meant everything to us. Renee felt her eyes sting, and she didn't bother trying to hide it. Your mother would be so proud of you, she said quietly. I hope so. Elijah looked down at his coffee. I think about her every time I fold that bill. I think about how easy it would have been for that stranger to walk past us. He didn't know our names either. He just decided we were worth showing up for. And now you do the same thing. I tried to. Yesterday reminded me why it matters. Preston looked at me and decided, in about 3 seconds, that I didn't belong somewhere I'd been welcome for almost a year. That's exactly what people did to my mother every single day for most of her life. Nobody should have to prove they're worth basic respect before they're given it. Renee reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over his. The same gesture she might have offered a patient who needed to know someone was truly listening. For what it's worth, she said, you've never once made me feel like I had to prove anything to you. Not once in almost a year. That's because you never had to. The story of what happened at the Wildflower Diner didn't stay contained to the neighborhood for long. A grainy phone video, shaky, poorly lit, but unmistakably clear about what it showed, found its way onto social media within a day, racking up views far beyond what anyone involved could have predicted. The caption read simply, "Man humiliated in front of his daughter turns out to own the entire company." Reporters started calling Banks' hospitality group's front office within 48 hours. Elijah declined most of the interview requests, uncomfortable with the idea of turning what had happened to his daughter into a headline for strangers to consume. But he agreed to one short statement, delivered calmly and without theatrics, because he understood that some things were worth saying clearly once and then leaving alone. What happened at the Wildflower Diner wasn't really about me, he told the single reporter he agreed to speak with. It happens every day, in places all over this country, to people who don't own the building and can't make a phone call that changes the outcome. I got to walk away from that moment with an apology and a name in the news. Most people don't get that. That's the part worth paying attention to. Not what happened to me, but what happened to everyone else when nobody's watching. The interview ran short, only a few paragraphs in a local paper, but it circulated further than anyone expected. Community organizations reached out, asking whether Banks' hospitality group would consider funding anti-discrimination training across the service industry more broadly. Elijah said yes before the woman on the phone had finished the sentence. Preston Hale, for his part, disappeared from the company's record within the week, his termination process quietly and without fanfare, not out of mercy, but because Elijah had no interest in making an example of one man, when the deeper problem was a pattern of assumptions that stretched far wider than a single diner on 5th and Miller. We're not just replacing him, Elijah told the executive team during a meeting that following Thursday. We're rebuilding how every location trains its managers on this. Preston isn't the only person who's ever looked at someone and decided they didn't belong. He's just the one who happened to get caught doing it to me. 2 weeks after the incident, Elijah called every employee across the diner chain's 12 locations into a single meeting, held in the largest of the company's event spaces downtown. It wasn't mandatory in the sense of threat. Nobody was told their job depended on showing up, but almost everyone came anyway, curiosity and quiet solidarity pulling them in from every corner of the city. Renee sat near the front with Tasha, both of them still in their diner aprons, having come straight from a morning shift. Curtis, the security guard who'd hesitated that day, stood near the back wall, arms crossed, uncertain whether he was welcome given his small part in what had happened. Elijah found him before the meeting started and shook his hand. "I saw you hesitate that day," he said quietly. "That mattered more than you probably realized in the moment." Curtis looked surprised, then something like relief passed over his face. "I didn't do enough." You did more than most people manage when they're told to follow an order that feels wrong. I'm not interested in punishing people for the position they were put in. I'm interested in making sure nobody's put in that position again. When the meeting began, Elijah didn't stand behind the podium. He stood in the open floor space in front of the gathered staff, the same way he might have stood in any diner, and spoke without notes. Some of you have probably heard some version of what happened at the Wildflower 2 weeks ago, he said. I want to tell you the real version, plainly, because I think you deserve that more than a company memo. He told them everything. The confrontation, his daughter's small trembling voice asking why the man was being mean to them, the security guards, the phone call. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The room was silent enough that his measured voice carried easily to every corner. I could have ended that story a lot of ways, he continued. I could have told Preston who I was the second he opened his mouth. That would have ended it fast. But it wouldn't have taught me anything about how this company actually treats people when nobody important is sitting in the booth. And what I learned is that we have work to do. He explained a new training program, the revised policies around how customers could be asked to leave, the anonymous reporting line being set up specifically for staff who witnessed something they felt uncomfortable challenging in the moment. He talked about Curtis, without naming him directly, and the quiet courage it took to hesitate, even when you weren't sure hesitating was allowed. I'm not asking any of you to be perfect, Elijah said near the end. I'm asking you to remember that everyone who walks through our doors is somebody's whole world to somebody, a father to a little girl, a mother to a family, somebody's whole reason for getting through a hard week. Treat them that way before you know anything else about them, not after. The room stayed quiet for a moment after he finished, the particular quiet of people absorbing something that would stay with them longer than the meeting itself. Then, slowly, applause began, not thunderous, not performative, just steady and genuine, moving to the room the way real appreciation usually does. Renee clapped along with everyone else, watching the man she'd poured coffee for almost every morning for a year stand in front of a room full of strangers and turn his own daughter's worst morning into something that might protect somebody else's child from the same thing. The company launched a mandatory training program within a month. Not punitive in tone, but rooted in the same lesson Elijah had carried since childhood. Every manager across every location would sit through it. Every new hire would hear the story, though rarely with his name attached, of a father and daughter treated unfairly in a diner that was supposed to feel like the safest, most ordinary place in the world. Renee's nursing school graduation fell on a bright Saturday morning in late spring, 6 months after the incident at the diner. She'd spent the better part of 2 years imagining that day. The cap, the gown, the moment her name would be called across a stage while her family cheered from the audience. What she hadn't imagined, not really, was who else might be sitting in that crowd. Elijah arrived early, Amara beside him in a dress she'd insisted on picking out herself, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies that had clearly been arranged with more care than a florist typically put into a delivery order. You came, Renee said afterward, finding them near the edge of the crowd once the ceremony had ended, still wearing her cap slightly crooked from the excitement of the last hour. I told you I would, Elijah said. I don't break promises. You should know that about me by now. Amara held out the bouquet with both hands, beaming. These are from both of us. Daddy let me pick them. They're beautiful. Renee crouched to Amara's height, accepting the flowers carefully. Thank you, sweetheart. Are you a real nurse now? I am, as of about 20 minutes ago. Amara considered this with the seriousness she brought to most important matters. Does that mean you can fix broken arms? Not exactly my specialty, but I know people who can. Good, Amara said decisively, because I fell off the monkey bars last week, and Daddy said next time I need a real doctor, not just a Band-Aid. Elijah laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in the way Renee had rarely heard from him in their year of quiet morning conversations. She's exaggerating. It was a very small scrape. It bled a lot, Amara insisted. It did not. It bled a little. Renee watched the two of them argue good-naturedly over specifics of a scraped knee, and felt something settle warmly in her chest. Not quite romance, not yet anything with a name she was ready to put to it, but something steady and real all the same. A friendship built slowly across a year of black coffee and buttered toast, tested by an ugly moment neither of them had asked for, and strengthened by the way he'd handled it. Not with anger, but with quiet, unshakable integrity. Her mother found them a few minutes later, weaving through the crowd with a bouquet of her own and a proud, teary smile that had been fixed in place since the moment Renee's name was called across the stage. "Mama, this is Elijah," Renee said, "and this is Amara." "There," she paused, searching for the right word, aware suddenly of how many possible words there were, and how none of them felt entirely complete. "They're friends of mine. Good friends." "The diner friends," her mother said, recognition dawning. "I've heard about you, too. Especially you." She looked at Amara. "Renee tells me you got very strong opinions about whipped cream." "You can never have too much," Amara said solemnly. "I like her already," Renee's mother said, laughing, and the easy warmth of it settled over the small group standing at the edge of the crowded auditorium lawn. They stayed for nearly an hour after the ceremony ended, taking pictures, trading stories, Amara insisting on being included in at least 6 different photographs with an authority that made everyone comply without argument. When it finally came time to leave, Renee walked them to the parking lot, unwilling to let the day end without a few more minutes. "Your first shift at the hospital is Monday, right?" Elijah asked. "Monday morning, 7 a.m. Nervous?" "Terrified," Renee admitted, "but the good kind, the kind that means it matters." "That's usually the only kind worth having," Elijah said. "The nerves that come from something not mattering are the ones you should worry about." Amara tugged on Renee's sleeve before they parted ways. "Will you still come to the diner, even though you're a nurse now?" Renee crouched down to her eye level again, the bouquet of lilies still cradled carefully in one arm. "I promise. Some things don't change just because other things do." Amara seemed to accept this as a satisfactory guarantee, and gave her a quick, fierce hug before climbing into the car, already chattering to her father about what flavor of celebration ice cream the occasion clearly demanded. Renee stood in the parking lot long after their car had pulled away, cap still crooked, diploma tucked under one arm, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember like every hard year that had come before this one had been building toward exactly this kind of morning. 6 months into the new training program, a woman named Dolores Reyes, who managed one of the company's smaller diner locations across town, wrote a letter to the corporate office that eventually made its way to Elijah's desk. She wasn't writing to complain. She was writing because something had happened at her location that she thought he ought to know about. A young man had come in one afternoon, clearly unhoused, asking only to use the restroom and sit somewhere warm for a few minutes out of the cold. Under the old policies, under the old unspoken culture that had let a manager like Preston Hale rise to a regional position in the first place, an employee might have moved him along without a second thought, might have decided in 3 seconds that he didn't belong there and acted accordingly. Instead, one of Dolores's newer servers, a young man barely out of high school named Marcus Webb, remember the training session from months earlier, the story of father and daughter humiliated over nothing more than an old jacket and a pair of worn boots. He brought the young man a cup of coffee on the house and let him sit by the window for as long as he needed. "I don't know if that's the kind of thing you wanted this training to do," Dolores wrote, "but I thought you should know it's working. Not because anybody's afraid of getting in trouble, because they actually understand why it matters now." Elijah read that letter 3 times before setting it down. He thought about his mother, about the stranger who'd never explained himself, about the version of kindness that asked for nothing in return and expected no audience to witness it. He thought about Marcus Webb, a young server he'd never met, quietly continuing a chain that had started decades earlier in a diner very much like this one. He had the letter framed and hung in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly what all of it was supposed to be for. Life at the Wildflower Diner returned to its rhythms in the months that followed, though not exactly the same rhythms as before. Renee had been promoted, at Elijah's quiet insistence, into a part-time supervisory role at the diner, she still worked a few shifts a week even after starting her first nursing position at the Children's Hospital across town, a role she once only dreamed about while flipping through anatomy flashcards between tables. "You don't have to keep working here," Elijah told her one morning, watching her balance a coffee pot and a stack of menus with the ease of 2 years' practice. "I know," Renee said. "I want to. This place matters to me. Besides, somebody's got to keep an eye on your tipping habits." He still came in most mornings, still ordered black coffee and buttered toast, still sat at the same table by the window whenever it was free, and every day, without fail, he left the same crisp $10 bill beside his empty cup. Not because anyone was watching anymore, not because there was a story left uncovered, but because it had never really been about being seen in the first place. Amara came along more often now, old enough to understand a little more of the story her father had promised her, young enough that pancakes with too much syrup still counted as the best part of any morning. On one particular Saturday, months after everything had settled, she watched her father fold a familiar bill and set it beside his cup. "Daddy, yeah, baby? Is that the same kind of $10? Like the story you told me about?" Elijah looked at his daughter for a long moment, surprised, as he often was, by how much she noticed and how much she remembered. "Exactly the same kind," he said. "Grandma Ruth taught me that even the smallest kindness can be the thing that gets somebody through their hardest day. I want you to remember that too, even after I'm not around to remind you." Amara nodded slowly, turning the idea over the way she turned over everything important. Then she reached into the small change purse she carried in her backpack, the one she used for buying stickers at the corner store, and pulled out a single, slightly crumpled dollar bill. "Can I leave one too?" Elijah felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "You sure you want to give that up? I know you were saving for stickers." "Grandma Ruth would want me to," Amara said simply, as if the matter were already settled, and in her mind it was. She placed the dollar carefully beside her father's 10, smoothing it flat with small, careful fingers, the same quiet ceremony he performed every morning for years, now passed down without a single word of instruction needed. Renee, clearing the table beside them, caught the moment and had to look away for a second, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. Some lesson, she thought, didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be witnessed. Amara's 9th birthday fell on a Saturday that October, almost exactly a year after the confrontation that had changed so much without either of them fully realizing it at the time. Elijah threw her a small party in the backyard of their house. Nothing extravagant, just a handful of friends from school, a homemade cake that leaned slightly to one side despite his best efforts, and a string of paper lanterns Amara had insisted on hanging herself. Even though most of them ended up crooked, Renee came, arriving with a wrapped gift and a card that made Amara squeal the moment she opened it. A junior nurse's kit, complete with a stethoscope that actually worked and a small notepad for patient charts, which Amara immediately put to use examining every guest at the party with theatrical seriousness. "Your heart sounds normal," she informed her father solemnly, stethoscope pressed to his chest. "But you need more vegetables." "Duly noted, doctor." "Nurse," Amara corrected. "I'm going to be a nurse." Like Renee, Elijah glanced at Renee across the yard, who was laughing at something one of Amara's friends had said, sunlight catching in her hair, entirely unaware she was being discussed. "That's a good thing to want to be," he told his daughter. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the paper lanterns had been carefully taken down and stored for next year, Elijah sat on the back steps with Amara curled against his side, both of them tired in the pleasant way that follows a good day. "Daddy, yeah, baby, do you think Grandma Ruth would like Renee?" The question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. Amara had a way of noticing things long before anyone expected her to. The same quiet observance that had first alerted her to a folded $10 bill appearing on a diner table every single morning. "I think she'd like her very much," Elijah said carefully. "Grandma Ruth always said you could tell everything about a person by how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them. Renee's like that. Always has been, long before she knew who I was. I like her too, Amara said, yawning against his shoulder. She lets me have extra whipped cream even when you say no. I noticed that. Don't be mad. I'm not mad, Elijah said, smiling into the darkening evening. Some rules are worth bending for the right people. They sat together for a while longer, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the houses across the street, and Elijah found himself thinking, not for the first time, about how strange and generous life could be, how a stranger's forgotten kindness 3 decades ago had somehow rippled forward into this exact moment, this daughter, this quiet evening, this unlikely friendship that had grown out of the worst morning either of them had experienced in years. He thought about his mother often these days, more than he had in a long time, and it no longer came with the sharp ache it once had. It came instead with something closer to gratitude, the understanding that some debts were never meant to be paid back in full, only paid forward, one folded bill and one small act of decency at a time. Years later, long after Preston Hale had become a distant, half-remembered name, and the video of that morning had faded from anyone's social media feed, the Wildflower Diner remained exactly what it had always been, a small, unremarkable corner restaurant that smelled like coffee and bacon and something warmer than either. But regulars who'd been coming long enough noticed a small brass plaque that had appeared near the register one spring. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. It read simply, "In memory of Ruth Banks, who taught her son that kindness costs nothing and changes everything." Nobody who read it knew the whole story unless they asked. Most people didn't ask. They just ordered their coffee, left whatever tip felt right to them, and went on with their day, never realizing that the diner they'd wandered into by chance had once been the site of a small, quiet injustice that changed the way an entire company thought about the people employed. Elijah still came in most mornings. Amara, taller now, still teased her father gently about the exact same order he'd placed for years. And on the counter, beside whatever cup he was drinking from that day, there was always a crisp $10 bill, folded once, placed with the same quiet intention it always had been. Not a mystery any more to anyone who knew him, but no less meaningful for having finally been explained. Some promises, once made, are simply kept. Quietly, faithfully, one morning at a time. Elijah never set out to teach anyone a lesson that October morning. He never wanted the video, the headlines, the reporters calling his office for a quote. All he wanted, in the moment Preston Hale stood over his daughter's booth with his arms crossed, was for Amara to understand that being treated unfairly was never a reflection of her worth or his. Everything that came after, the training programs, the letters from managers like Dolores Reyes, the quiet courage of employees like Curtis and Marcus Webb who chose to hesitate when hesitating wasn't easy. All of it grew out of that one simple instinct to protect his daughter without teaching her to answer cruelty with cruelty of his own. That, in the end, was the real inheritance Ruth Banks had left behind. Not the company, not the properties, not the wealth that had followed decades of careful, patient work. It was the understanding that dignity wasn't something you had to earn from people who'd already decided you didn't deserve it. It was something you carried with you regardless, steady and unshaken, until the truth eventually caught up to everyone else. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a folded bill, a chair offered a stranger, a father's steady hand on his daughter's shoulder, turns out to be the thing that outlives every headline, every hardship, and every person who ever doubted where it came from. Because goodness, even when it goes unnoticed for a while, is never wasted. It just waits for the right morning to be understood.